Welcome. Hello, hello. I am so excited to introduce everyone to our amazing panelists full of dynamic women in theater. I'm just going to go around the screen as I see you. So Tanaquil Márquez is currently directing and working on an adaptation, a bilingual version of Twelfth Night. That's also a musical that's going to be part of Delaware Shakespeare Community Tour. So just now she finished a 2-week rehearsal process. Tanaquil is also the producing director of Teatro del Sol in Philadelphia, which is a bilingual theater company, and also the artistic director of Teatro Esperanza in New Brunswick. We have Gina Pisasale, who is also in Philadelphia. Gina is a resident dramaturg at People's Light in Malvern, Pennsylvania. Gina is also a freelance dramaturg, and Gina has worked all over the country. And what brings Gina to the conversation tonight is also that Gina has dramaturged a production of The Winter's Tale at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, which we'll dive into later on today. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Gina is currently getting her PhD in Asian American Theater Studies and American Dramaturgy. Also, we have Madeline Sayet, and Maddie had directed our community tour of As You Like It 2 years ago for Del Shakes. Maddie is the executive director of the Yale Indigenous Performing Arts Program and founded it, am I correct? And no, didn't found it. You're the executive director. Okay, my bad. Also, Maddie is an award recipient of the National Champion of Change Award and has been on both Forbes 30 under 30 and 40 under 40 lists. Woo-hoo! And we have Debra and Byrd joining us. Debra is a 5th generation Harlem resident, actor, director, producer. Debra Ann founded the Harlem Shakespeare Festival. Debra Ann is also the executive director of Take Wing and Soar, which champions young women and artists of color in classical theater. Welcome, everyone. Please, I welcome you to unmute yourselves. And one final thing before we get started, because I think as many people across the country give thanks in various ways during the season, I wanted to take a moment to offer a space for us to acknowledge the land on which we work and play. From Del Shakes' perspective, Delaware Shakespeare has its offices on the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We acknowledge them as the original stewards of this land. I'm also coming to you from this land. And panelists, if you would like to make your own land acknowledgement, I invite you to do so at this moment.
Hey, I'm Maddie. I'm Citizen Mohegan Tribe, and I'm currently on our traditional homelands here at Mohegan in Connecticut.
I'm Gina, she, her, and I am zooming in from Lenni Lenape land.
I'm Tanaquil, or Tana, she, her, and I'm zooming in from Seminole land in Florida.
Hi, I'm Debra Ann Byrd, she, her, they. I am zooming in from Manhattan, land of the Lenape.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right, so let's jump right in. Tonight, we are talking about culturally specific productions. I actually wanted to think about that term for a moment, and we've all worked in various fashions on what's often considered quote unquote non-traditional or culturally specific or race specific productions of Shakespeare or other classical theater. In leading into this conversation, may I ask one of you to offer up what your idea of a cultural production, a culturally specific production means? Gina, since you're our resident dramaturg, may I offer this one up to you first?
The dramaturgs respond. They often don't put originate, but here we go. So we had a kind of a pre-meeting before this, and a couple of us were saying that every production really is a culturally specific production because they all have rules in terms of language and power and traditions and assumptions and how people interact with each other I mean, in terms of what defines a culture. So technically all productions are culturally specific in some way or other. In this context, it's interesting to think of what's visible when you think of it in an American context. And oftentimes when folks that have, have not necessarily shared kind of the mainstream spotlight enter and, kind of are, was just like there's difference potentially, like how you would from what is usually kind of a mainstream, is when, I don't know, you kind of get attention as something that is culturally other. So I think that's when culture becomes more explicit, and potentially visible and intentionally crafted. So in that way, like within this conversation, I think that is a way we can describe what we mean by culturally specific Shakespeare.
Yeah, absolutely. Would anyone like to respond to Gina or express more about the idea of what it means to make or think about culturally specific productions? Yeah, Tana.
Yeah, in regards to Shakespeare as well, it's going beyond stamping a theme uh, of culture diversity on a play and calling it that. It's really dissecting the project. And I think with Shakespeare, it's building a bridge between the Shakespearean language and what you want to say, and having people recognize, and I love the word intentional, that there are critical and central storylines with BIPOC, Indigenous, Latinx, trans, queer communities, and how those stories are critical, and characters and plot lines, and then finding those connections in the play. And that's how you create that social communion with people who are attending and watching. And those connections are the most valuable and the strongest when you have that community.
I love that. I love that idea of finding the connections from your cultural specific experience and perspective in Shakespeare somehow. Oh, Madeline, I saw you unclick.
I was going to say, I also think it's an invitation to consider what it is that you're prioritizing. I mean, so like in the case of Native Shakespeare productions, very often, there's many different Native nations represented in the room, and so it's not one of our cultures, but all of our cultures that are being brought into conversation. But not only being brought into conversation with our own individual interpretations of what the text might mean, but also how we engage with the moments in the text that are sexist, that are racist, that are colonial in very many instances, right? And instead of saying, oh, that's neutral, let's just accept that, actually grappling with and engaging with like how we want to question and interrogate specific not only moments but frameworks, hierarchies, constructs and systems within our own framework of understanding, whether that's simply acknowledging it or dismantling it. The process of actually continuously engaging with, instead of letting the text rest as some sort of fabricated neutral, I feel like is also very present when doing this work in any culturally specific frame, I think, because of the intentionality that Tana mentioned.
Yeah, I love that. And that actually leads us into this idea of what is the process by which we ideate and create and make a production that is culturally specific and maintain cultural sensitivity while doing so. Deborah Ann, you had mentioned that you have worked on a culturally specific and all Black Richard III, Coriolanus, African warrior, and were part of a reading that was a global Antony and Cleopatra. Can you talk to us about maybe what first strikes you about a Shakespeare script that might make you say, I want to do an all Black version, or Coriolanus has to be African warrior? What was the thinking for you behind that one?
Well, I was a member in residence at the National Black Theater for many years. Actually, Take Wing and Soar Productions started there, and my mentor was Dr. Barbara Ann Tier, the founder and CEO of the National Black Theater. And in my conversations with her while I was working to write the mission and build the company and have all the ideas about what I might do. My only reference was what I had learned at college, what I had actually worked on, in scenes and monologues at school. And she offered to me, Deborah Ann, perhaps you might want to think about um, not just art but culture, because she said culture um, is richer and most times more important than the art. And so she encouraged me to think about how I would incorporate people of African descent and a Latinx community, because that is my background. And so when I was thinking about Shakespeare's, the first one, Richard III, actually the director said, let's set it in a war-torn African nation. And I said, yes, great, let's do that. And we did not much more than, just wore certain kinds of sashes and head wraps and things like that, not necessarily putting the full culture on it, but just like an idea of it, yes? And then when I went to do Coriolanus the African Warrior, I knew that I really liked the Maasai. Something about that tribe from the East Africa was very appealing to me, and so I thought about in honor of them and specific culture of that country, that we would specifically wear the dress, uh, do the dances from that region in Africa. So we incorporated African dance and movement and how the Maasai move this way. And something about that was celebratory, and something about that was exciting. And it also put the patrons in mind of learning about the culture of Africa. A lot of times we don't learn about that. And so it was a way of doing the Shakespeare, honoring the text as it was, but also marrying it with the culture of people of African descent. And we did it specifically for our audiences and for the actors to just try their hand at it. The cast was multiracial, but everyone put on an African being, if I can say it like that. Everyone put on the idea and the spirit of the Maasai. And we put on the show, and it was really wonderful, and a lot of people enjoyed that culturally specific show.
Yeah, it sounds like, another thing that you're pointing to is that more specific research that you did as a company in order to study the Maasai sounds like it was a more culturally enriching experience, if I'm correct.
Yes,
There-
absolutely, it was. It was. Richard III was great, and we did, we never really changed the text, but it was great, and we did it as is. Of course, we had to make some cuts, like everyone has to make cuts in Shakespeare, but um, it was wonderful the way it was. But this time, I wanted to think more about a specific nation, a specific tribe, and see what happens if we more deeply explore that. What does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that sound like? How do these folks move? How do they move the same and different from how we move here? How are the dances similar? How are they different? How is the dress different, the same? How is the jewelry different, the same? How is the past informing the present? All of that became like front and center, and it worked. It was really beautiful. It was directed by Jeffrey Thompson, and the movement was by Diane Harvey Salam, and it was a cast of at least 20 actors on the stage, holding their beautiful spears and standing tall and erect, and it was really gorgeous, indeed.
I'd love to talk about this idea of, what it means to put something on versus investigate cultural specificity, right?
Yes.
Like
Hmm.
in developing a production that is culturally specific, sometimes I do feel like there's some theaters that just culturally appropriate and, you know, put a wash of a culture on, or their idea of a general like Pan-Asian or Pan-African culture on something, but to
Hmm.
deeply investigate something is different. So actually, Gina, if you wouldn't mind, could you tell us about what the process was like in The Winter's Tale? So, for everyone watching, The Winter's Tale at Oregon Shakespeare Festival was directed by an amazing Chinese director, or director of Chinese origin, named Desdemona Chiang. The first half of the play that takes place in kind of a closed kingdom ruled by a very intelligent but kind of severely strict king, Leontes, was inspired by Han Dynasty China, if I'm correct. So all that whole entire portion of the play was entirely an Asian cast. And then when they broke into the more free-flowing, across the world kingdom of the best friend king Polixenes, it was like Ashland, Oregon. I mean, it was flowers everywhere. It was hippie. It was multicultural, and it was really loose. And for me, watching that production, I, as the first generation Vietnamese daughter of immigrants who totally grew up with a lot of Chinese and Vietnamese culture, it resonated with me so deeply. Like that strict kingdom of Leontes was the severe Han Dynasty Chinese framework. So Gina, I'd love to hear what that process was like, and what were some of the beautiful moments, and possibly what were some things that you would see doing differently now.
It's so interesting of like just the origin stories of any of these productions. It was a board member at OSF that was said, okay, you've done like Latinx Romeo and Juliet, you've done, you know, African American R&J, you know, like, so where's the Asian, like the Asian show, like where's the Asian Shakespeare? So, and how OSF works is that obviously, you know, you have the Shakespeare canon and like, well, what's coming up that we haven't done in the 5-year, 10-year, and like Winter's Tale was one of them. Desdemona Chiang was incredibly like an up and coming director and had relationships at OSF. Loved Winter's Tale. And so in terms of like, it didn't all just happen out of the blue. You know, there was an individual, there were like a collection of people that were really interested in investigating this idea. And then there, you know, production demands and the idea of doing like a quote, what does it mean to do like a quote unquote Asian Shakespeare, right? And what is the impetus of that directive, you know, from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival on a Chinese American director? So just and you know, that it would be under the microscope in many ways because it was a first. So that decisions had to be made because the idea of, I mean, I want to say like there are potentially wrong ways to do it, but there are many right ways, and but you had to decide, like every decision was just one way of doing it. So they actually started looking at Qing dynasty because it was ruled by a tyrant, so, you know, kind of led by that. But that was actually a really terrible phase in Chinese history, and they shifted it to Han because it was a period of so it was 206 to 220, like 206 BC to 220 AD, and it was like that's the golden age of China. It's when, you know, Silk Road was happening. It's when like just prosperity, trade was happening, because Sicilia, it's a peaceful kingdom that all of a sudden gets disrupted by this moment of kind of crazy town from the aunties. So that's why we said it in Han Dynasty, and it was actually the costume designer who is from China, who she's a Chinese immigrant. Her name is Helen Huang, is on faculty at University of Maryland. Who said, you know, I don't think we should be doing Qing. I think we should be doing Han because of this kind of narrative. So just the decision making along the way was wonderfully collaborative. But then we initially were, you know, in terms of design, thinking we would be just do our due diligence in terms of research, in terms of what did Han Dynasty look like, feel like, and then we cast. Then there was casting that happened, and like Madeline was saying too, there is incredible diversity among Asian American population. I mean, one thing that we fight against is this idea of Asian America as a monolith, but in casting, the idea of who could identify as Asian American, who could as Chinese American, as Japanese American. I'm a Korean adoptee American, and there was South Asian in the cast as well. So like, and there were half, you know, East Asian actors as well. So the idea of like having a Cecilia that was more Han inspired than a literal Han, but was due because of the casting. Because we had a South Asian Paulina, we had a Korean American Hermione, we had a half Asian Leontes. So how it all came about was all because of people, honestly. Like there was never like an overriding concept per se. So it was like this idea of like an Asian Pangea. But then as we were making decisions about what Asia, what China, you know, what, because we were saying Han Dynasty, which is a Chinese dynasty, would look like, we continuously questioned about why we thought what we thought when we were making decisions. So it was like, is what we're thinking, because all history is curated. All history comes from some version, because none of us were there, you know, in 206 BC. So this Desdemona constantly saying, like, are we making this because we think it's Chinesey? She kept using that word. Or it's like, why are we thinking that this is particularly Asian? Or what feels Asian? What does Asianness mean when we're intersecting it with this story in this room that has a diversity of Asian identities in it? And including, you know, first generation immigrants and like fourth generation you know, immigrants, and I'm a, you know, Korean adoptee. So in terms of creating culture, creating like a cultural production, so much of it was in the process and had to do with the individuals that we're making. I think so much depends when you're doing culturally specific work on the people and the individuals that are in the room, and that constant interrogation of what this one decision means, because we are creating culture that we are presenting to the rest of the world as Asian, you know, and
Oh,
like the
that's so good.
responsibility of that, but also the great adventure of that only like this body gets to do, I think is just the wonderful opportunity that something like this project offered. I
Yes.
don't know if that was the answer to your
Oh,
question.
no. I'd love to explode this idea that yes, like in creating culturally specific productions, it's all about constant interrogation and having a constant ongoing conversation with the people in the room, re-examining one's identity and relationship to the text and the vision, and having input from everybody. I mean, you just named having input from the cast, you the dramaturg, Desdemona the director, the costume designer, that everybody in process is actually in collaboration with each other, trying to take care of each other's cultural identity, the play's vision. And I think it's beautiful. Madeline, I know that you have created such an opening for so many Native artists in theater. And I'd love for you to talk about how you care for artists within a process, if you don't mind.
Sure. Something that just came to mind in relationship to this coming out of the last conversation was um, I'll never forget there was a series of like, you know, audience review sheets that came in after we did our All Native Winter's Tale. And I just remember one that said like, this seems like a wasted opportunity for these Native people to not have educated us about their culture. And I was like, well, what did you think was going, like we were doing the Winter's Tale. Like we were a bunch of Native people from a bunch of different Native nations doing the Winter's Tale. So how are we going to be educating you about our culture, right? Which is a thing that doesn't exist within that process. And so much of it for me has been um, my relationship, I feel like, to culturally specific work has been very specific. Sorry, it's the same word, two sentences. But has been very specific, I think, because it came sort of directly from a process of liberation. The very first production I ever directed was a production of The Tempest that specifically dealt with the question what would happen if Caliban could get his language back, and not with native language, right, but with Mohegan. And like Mohegan, the prologue being in Mohegan, and it's setting it up as a story that is about like, you know, the island is here and the colonists leave at the end. So this is a thing that happened a long time ago and then they left. So this like alternative Mohegan universe in which like, you know, this is a story of something that happened a long time ago when the colonists came, but then like at the end of The Tempest, they leave. And the specificity of that, because as a director who is Mohegan, I'm not suddenly going to become Cherokee. That's not a thing that can happen. But that actually, like, also as someone who is a who comes from a leadership family within my tribe. My mom is both our medicine woman and also from even before that was our tribal historian. And my great aunt was the medicine woman before her. So I know that I have a responsibility as a diplomat at any time as a member of a sovereign nation. And I think that's a thing that gets forgotten a lot. And so when I'm gathering people in the room, I have to take a lot of care around knowing that each one of these people is not only from a different sovereign nation, but they have different responsibilities and protocols as relate to their individual, cultural practices from their different tribes. And so really any time that, we were doing an all native Shakespeare production, the liberation came not in the picking a tribe and making everyone be that, but in the actual like allowance for everyone to exist as their full selves and imagine a world in which we get to be all the people and we get to like explore and imagine from our unique perspectives, but also knowing that the cultural protocols in the room are different, right? If a 90-year-old elder says we're going to drum in this scene, I can't I can't stop it unless another elder says something, right? So there's certain moments within just like tribal cultural protocols too, where it's like, like I as a young director, people think like she's the director. It's like, well, no, actually, there are protocols that that counter the traditional protocols of the Western rehearsal room when it comes to certain power dynamics. And so all that is to say, like when we were, I mean, in all of the productions that I've done that are involving Native artists, the goal has always been less about figuring out how we're going to teach non-native people something concrete and more about how we create the space for each artist to be their full selves and thereby create the opportunity for native audience members to imagine themselves more fully. Because like while there is the truth of the fact that like yes, if we do an all native production of Macbeth and they see us performing a role that they understand, they might identify with us more. That's only going to get us so far compared to the kids that are in a product, compared to when I was working on Midsummer Night's Dream, and these two little Lakota girls who were really into Shakespeare suddenly were in a cast with a whole bunch of other Native people, and the way that they were introduced to Shakespeare was with certain cultural protocols in the rehearsal room, with people introducing themselves in their own native languages, thereby making native languages cooler, thereby changing the way that we think about the way our indigenous languages operate in relationship to Shakespeare. So for me, culturally specific Shakespeare productions were always not about necessarily how do we teach something new about Shakespeare, which inevitably happens, but how do we actually reclaim these things that were forced on us for ourselves, knowing that as Native people we were stolen from our homes, beaten for speaking our languages, forced to give them up, and forced to learn Shakespeare. So if Shakespeare is going to be ours now, how do we actually find the ways in which it makes sense through our own viewpoints instead of being forced to inhabit it from someone else's?
It is so wonderfully liberating to even hear you describe that, the reclaiming of language and just the honoring of everyone's protocol. And it just makes me realize that that's how everyone should be honoring each other and working, like allowing each other to be their fullest artist self, right? Tana, you're making a bilingual musical adaptation of Twelfth Night. I'd love for you to share what the process has been like so far, and if you find something that is just liberating and different about this process, that's different from the, I'll say the standard protocols of a white patriarchal way of working in classical theater or Shakespeare, like we all did in college, I think.
Yeah, I relate to so much with what Gina has said. And the word that really sticks out is collaboration. And I think that this project is on its way to success and on its way to what it needs to be because of that collaboration. When I first was introduced to Twelfth Night and to Del Shakes, it was Liz Felios, who was already starting to work on the composition of the show. This show was already supposed to be a musical before it was a bilingual musical. And as she was working on the show, she found the correlation between Viola, who we've changed the name to Violeta, and how it was such a string with the immigrant experience. And then I got involved with the project, being Latinx and working with immigrant communities in New Jersey and Philadelphia, and how we could find a way to really weave in that, well, it was already there in terms of Viola needing to survive, and how when an immigrant comes to this country, survival is the number one thing on what they have to do. And so it was strong, and working through the project, at first it was kind of like writing this beautiful music and translating some of the Shakespeare text in English into Spanish. And what was really beautiful was having this show develop more and more and more, and kind of like cracking it open and seeing that our original concept of that was kind of like what you were saying, like putting something on top, putting that stamp on. It wasn't really meshing. It wasn't weaving the way we saw it out at first. And with everything that's happening in Pennsylvania right now with the Burke's, I can't remember what they call it, Burke's Family Community Center or something like that, but really detention center. It was just such a, it's so now and so present, unfortunately, and it has been. And it was just such a connection with what we were trying to do. And so our theme and our goal went beyond putting on this play, and our goal, we say, and it's strange to say because it's like, who are we to say this, but it's to shut down Burke's and to bring awareness to what's happening, because many people don't. And so with that, in our collaboration, we've brought on a character or a person who's playing Festi in the production. Jimena Violante is an amazing musician and artist, and they're from Mexico. And as we were developing the script and the music, they had a lot to say about their own take on what was going on as well. And so then we started developing some songs that were traditionally San Jorocho songs, which is traditional to Mexico. And also commenting with Madeline in terms of the I'm going to mess up this word, oh, wow.
Specificity.
Thank you so much. On this is extremely important. I was wondering, like, where do we put the twins from? I mean, it's a natural thing. I mean, not natural. It's very well known that Mexico, right next to the United States, is where a lot of immigrants are coming from. But did that fit with the whole ship and the storm crash? And I got a lot of comments outside of the project just saying, like, why are you trying to like make it so specific? Why are you trying to make it one Latin American place? Like, it should be, it happens everywhere. But I found being specific in it really started to develop the play stronger, and just connecting with like personal stories from people from Venezuela and what's happening in Venezuela right now, and how so many people are coming from that country here. And it's just been really amazing to have like mixing Venezuelan culture, Mexican culture. We're looking into how other characters can be from other places as well, in terms of connecting with Violeta and Sebastian. So perhaps not an immigrant from South America or Central America, but also from Haiti, from Jamaica, and how are they treated in the land of the United States? There's always a different hierarchy in that as well. And a Cuban American is treated differently than a Haitian American. And so it's just been, it's been a great collaboration to discover and to bring such authenticity to the show. And we've changed so much of the text. Like there's Shakespeare. I'm very inspired by Lorca, so there's a lot of Lorca-ness in it, and Spanish, and Robbie Hager, who's also another composer, also from Mexico, has written and composed a lot of the music as well. And it's just, if we didn't have all these seats available in this process, we wouldn't have had that collaborative experience. So I think that is the most important, is to not just have one seat for one specific person, like not one person represent Latinx or whatever, you know. If we have a multiple seats available, then we can get such intricate stories and different experiences.
That really speaks to like the intersectionality of what we do and how we can enrich Shakespearean text, right? Like when you examine the cultural specificity of each person in the cast and where they come from, and then you're like, okay, well, this person comes from Mexico, this person comes from Venezuela, they have a different relationship to the United States and a different relationship in terms of South American money or power or whatever. That informs like so many decisions about character, right? And about like it's all layered in there in Shakespeare. There's so much hierarchy and like complicated relationships in Shakespeare that can only be enhanced by investigating that true modern day cultural specificity that I think is like lovely. Gina, Madeline, Debra, Ann, Maddie, do you have, I see you writing down things, Gina. Do you have any responses to anything we've talked about so far? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I thought it was interesting what Tanaquil was saying about the different nationalities in the room and creating, and Maddie the same way, the different tribes, and so it was a little more of a challenge to be very specific about something. I think what's interesting about that to me is when we did, like for instance, our Coriolanus, we didn't investigate who was who because we were many races. I think we were just exploring and not necessarily shifting the language as much as just exploring. Just like children in the playground, I call it the sandbox. I call actors and say, hey, you want to play with us? And, you know, we just get in the sandbox and play. So the thing that made it culturally specific, I don't know if that's what we call it, but the thing that made it set in the place and the time that it was set is that the people were of one mind. Yeah. So not so much, you know, there was, let's see, there was like, I don't want to say 3 or 4 white folks, it was Asian folks, Latino folks, Black folks, and just all together. I think that all those folks together can represent a culture, whether or not they are of that culture. I think that if we have the same idea about it, the same mind about it, that we can all together celebrate it. And so that's what it looked like when we did Coriolanus. I was talking with the director, and the director said, you know, Debra, and one thing I do like about the company is that always on your stage, or at least 95% of the time, maybe 98% of the time, it is a mixed race cast on the stage. And, you know, that's how we do our diversity and inclusion. And so what becomes important is that everyone becomes of the same mind around a specific, of course, it is a collaboration around what we're going to do, what we're going to wear, what we're going to, with songs, with music, with dance. What became challenging with that is when the director said, I get we want to do Maasai, but I'm not sure how to do that. And I'm like, well, you got to do your research, you know, just us trying to get on the same page. And so I think we do it like that because if, in my head, if we can begin to understand what each other feels, um, then we begin to understand each other better. Meaning, if me and you B are in a show and it happens to be a show that is about an Asian culture, um, as long as we represent that culture honestly, um, and with integrity, I think that you and I together can tell that story.
I
Not
think
to,
everyone's getting at, right? But like by deeply investigating and by deeply interrogating everyone's culturally specific experience and perspective that each person brings to a project so that there's no erasure that happens, right? Like
mm-hmm,
I think, I don't know about you guys, but I know that for so long I felt like in studying Shakespeare as a teen and then as a college student, I felt like I was erased as an Asian. I was just to like think about the text and scansion and be a neutral actor. And
mm-hmm,
anything that I had as like any way I related to a character that was like, oh, that's so much like, you know, the moms and the aunties in my family. This is a very specific way in which we think and breathe. And this is what I'm bringing to the character. If I started talking about that in the early days, I felt that there was like almost a shutdown. It was like, oh
mm-hmm.
no, that's, don't bring that into the room. I'm wondering what all of you experienced. Was there a moment that made you reject Shakespeare as we were taught and
Mm-mm.
go forward into a direction that you could claim as yours?
I think for me, I was introduced to Shakespeare when I was a very small child, and so I was introduced to it at the same time I was introduced to our traditional Mohegan stories. So I never necessarily separated them in my mind. I just interpreted them for myself, and I think that gave me a lot of freedom because I was used to seeing my Mohegan aunties transform and transcend through story. So it didn't ever make sense to me that there would be a world in which any story would be told only by a bunch of white men and boys. Like that world never existed to me. The thing I found very strange was when people, when I started casting Native people and other Native people in my Shakespeare productions, they'd be like, wow, you're so innovative. And it's just like, well, why would I imagine a world in which I didn't exist? And yet, the thing that's trickiest about it is that like I have to say like no, someone else who's not native can't do that. And the reason why they can't do that is very specific, which is that the history of performance of native people in America is red face. It's genocidal erasure. In 2012, the reason why like the World Shakespeare Festival had the Worcester group come and have a bunch of white people dress up as native people and think that that's okay instead of having an actual group of native people perform is because America doesn't know native people. Like they've actively made native arts illegal for long periods of its history. They've actively done everything that they can to encourage the genocide of our tribal nations, which are sovereign nations, which because they are sovereign nations have very specific protocols around how we tell stories. And so I just want to say that it's really important when it comes to Indigenous stories for there to be deep cultural specificity because of the fact that we are grouped together in so much of the. I mean, it's Thanksgiving week. How many of us, had a childhood experience where someone encouraged us to make construction paper headdresses out of, like fake feathers and what was the narrative we were told around that? Like red face is a deep part of the theatrical tradition in America because it is designed to encourage genocide. And so when we reclaim anything, it has to be reclaimed with specificity and not just specificity that can be researched because most of the research that you will find is lies, right? So it has to be researched in the correct way by going to tribal elders, by, like there has to be actual deep conversations when doing this work. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that because even the process of research on culturally specific productions can be very complicated if you're not from that culture. I mean, because for example, the Red Face Worcester Group production had a ton of research attached to it, but who were they researching? Were they researching, Native voices, or were they researching things written about Native people by white perspectives? Or even in some cases, they were taking things written by Native people and misinterpreting them through their own minds into a thing that made sense because they weren't Native. And so until there isn't an equal level of representation of some kind, until, you know, we see more actual Native people on stage than we see, you know, white people playing Tiger Lily and Peter Pan, the conversation around cultural specificity has to be like really rigorous. Otherwise, it's just going to promote genocide.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Gina, I know you and I have talked about that. I mean, there are, you know, just because we're Asian faces and we're on a production doesn't make us the experts. Like there's still so much research in every single production I do where I am some sort of Asian. You know, there is deep research. There's like an extra layer of homework that we do, right, Gina? I'd love
Yeah.
to speak.
And I think, I mean, like what Madeline's hitting on too is just the importance of context, the importance of history, the importance of when you're making, what you're making, who is coming, who is in the conversation, because it is, representation is a matter of political power. It's who has been, right? You are asking someone to represent an entire history that has potentially never been seen before in a certain way. So there's always dangers of single narratives as well, which is why diversity, even within a certain culture, is so important to have in that conversation. But I think, you know, there isn't one prescriptive way to do a culturally specific production. This is all to say, like, you can do like mountains of research. You can have all of the PhDs in the history of, Native theater coming in to offer context. But in terms of like how you're actually curating the experience of the making, in addition to how you're presenting the culture, it's such a hugely, it's got such high stakes when you're talking about cultures that have not been able to voice their own presence. So because you get that great, like the wonderful, terrifying opportunity, I think just acknowledging the context of who is in the room, how you're making it, where you are in history. I mean, even in 2016, when The Winter's Tale, when we were making it, it was after, I mean, there was Nightingale controversy, which was set in a mythical China, but there were no Asian actors cast, or there were very few. The Mikado was making a resurgence. So even when you reach a moment where you're like, we figured it out for this moment, like the next day it could totally change. So that the conversation is complete, it's always dynamic. But to me, that's where the great opportunity in like multiracial, multicultural theater in the US can be such a vibrant conversation for things happening like right outside our door right now. Because it has to respond. No one is ever in a vacuum. You are always bringing in what you heard in the news, what your experience is, like what your idea of Native, what Latinx, like African American, like bodies are, and maybe subverting it, maybe offering, an assumed perspective, and then making it turn, like what are you doing with that assumed narrative that is coming in that you do need to consider when you are creating stories, I think, with culturally specific narratives at the center. But it's centering the experiences of the people that are gathered in that room, at that time, in that space, at that moment, which again could change like the next day, or could be different in a whole nother room that's like right next door.
But
So
I love what, I love this point, right? Theater, this art, it's a living, evolving, breathing thing that depends on the people that make it, right? So people are always asking, right? Like, why Shakespeare now? And I'm always like, why Shakespeare now? And I feel like we're actively answering that question through the work that we're making, right? Like by deeply investigating and interrogating what the cultural specificity of each person in the room is, and making space for those conversations, and making space for people to actually be themselves, and not hide it in discussing the work, and in seeing themselves fully as Shakespearean actors, directors, producers, dramaturgs, that it is your art form, that it is something that is directly connected to like Tana, the immigrant experience right now, or to, like that we can look at a piece of text that is over 400 something years old and find connections to our immediate identities, I think is what makes it so vital right now. We have an audience question that kind of connects to what Gina is saying. Okay, here's the question. Given the climate of today's racial divide and cultural insensitivity, how can you use Shakespeare productions to achieve meeting in the margins and cultural understanding to a mainly white audience? I'm going to volley that up for whoever would like to take that.
I'm sorry. I was reading that other question that I saw on the floor and I missed it. I'm sorry.
The question was, given the climate of today's racial divide and cultural insensitivity, how can you use Shakespeare productions to achieve meeting in the margins and cultural understanding to a mainly white audience? Maddie.
And Madeline, I think we both like breathed in at the same time.
I'm gonna let some other people go first.
Okay, Debra, Ann, then Maddie, then Gina.
Well, I'm just thinking, I have a little bit of a challenge answering that question because my audiences are 85% African American. So, um, that's how we do it here in Harlem, and yeah, there's 10% white folks in our audiences, and so it's hard for me to answer how to do it to an all white audience. I've been performing most of the time just my becoming Othello to mainly a white audience, and I think that whatever's on the stage, whoever's on the stage, if you represent yourself like you want to be represented, then no matter who's in the audience, you're going to get it. You're going to understand it. You're going to feel it. If you are truthful in what you're saying and how you're saying it, if you're tapping into your true emotional selves, if you are really digging deep to be able to tell that story the way that story needs to be told. Yeah, I'm a brown girl doing Shakespeare, but when I speak the speech, I speak it as trippingly as the next man or woman. That's why I say they sometimes because I say both. Anyway, so I think that whoever's on the stage, it is their job to come across and share their own understanding and their own culture. Only if I'm playing Cleopatra and I am who I am and I'm speaking it the way that I'm speaking it, if the director says you can't do that, then that is suppression of who I am and my culture. But I've never really had to run into that, and so I feel I have permission to speak it however it comes out of me, unless there is something just terribly wrong in my interpretation or the director needs to correct a certain specific thing. But if actors come with it, with what they're just bringing their whole selves, then, I think that the people get it. The people get it, the people understand. I think just go ahead and do it.
Maddie, I'll go to you now.
Yeah, I mean, I think to just try and hit a couple of points with this, because I actually think it's a very complex question. So the first thing is, yes, it's a cultural touchstone. So if there are things you identify within a character, and then you witness somebody from another culture, engaging with that text from their own deep perspective, perhaps in the conversation between those two perspectives and the way they see that moment, learning that happens. However, I was hosting a panel recently on Shakespeare and indigeneity that the poet Natalie Diaz was on, and somebody posed the question like, what Shakespeare text should we teach to help people learn about Native people? And she was like, that's like going to McDonald's and being like, I want to get fry bread. Like, you can't. That's not the thing. So I just wanted to also acknowledge that, like, if you're really looking for cultural understanding of another group of people, Shakespeare might be able to be a bridge point in terms of seeing a Shakespeare production that we're bringing our culture to, but ultimately it's still a colonized framework. We're still speaking in early modern English within the parameters of your comfort zone. And so I think that that also needs to be interrogated a little bit. The idea that, you know, that one, we would be performing it for a mainly white audience, which again, native Shakespeare, again, wasn't usually performed for a mainly white audience. But if we were, what is it you're really looking for in your comfort level, in the framework of understanding that you're willing to accept, would be the thing that I'd be curious to really look at. Because there is something really fun. I mean, the thing I love about Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare. I don't know Shakespeare. He's some guy. But is actually the way that over history, right? Like people take the story and they reinterpret it and they reinterpret it and they reinterpret it, and it means something different every single time. Like that, I think, is the really fun thing about culturally specific productions and how you can learn about people. But I don't know that doing that with only these texts, with only Shakespeare's text, and not doing it with any other texts is really quite going to get you to that place.
Yeah, I think that as a dramaturg, I was like, I want to question the question. So, I mean, this idea
Work it out, Gina.
of using, what does it mean to like use Shakespeare? And Madeline, to like your point too, is why has Shakespeare become this barometer of like the human experience? You know, you have like Harold Bloom being like, Shakespeare is the universal, I forget. Anyway, so potentially, yeah, it's wonderful poetry, wonderful humanity, but is there other, like, why do we use Shakespeare to experience a shared kind of emotional story, you know, that all of us sometimes, you know, with various levels of power are granted permission to enter into. But why use Shakespeare? The idea of like using Shakespeare is so interesting. And why has it become a kind of cultural neutral, you know, to then put cultural others onto, and then what becomes the leading edge of that storyline when you're doing that onto a quote unquote like cultural neutral. But then, you know, to what Madeline was saying, like where are you already even beginning that foundation to presentations, to conversations of cultural others? The question too of like of meeting in the margins is so interesting. I think that none of us, I mean, technically who is in the margin is not visible. So the whole idea of cultural specificity is to place in the center. So I think the idea of using Shakespeare is just, it provides really the skeleton, you know, just that's the kind of metaphor, like the text is the skeleton, and then you just build the rest of the body systems on top of that to become a fully functional like being in the world. So that if the text is like, you know, the skeleton, and we're just using Shakespeare as the skeleton to really center like a cultural conversation that's hopefully unique to this space and time, as I was saying before too, but it's never in the like the conversation is never in the margins. The conversation is fully centered, and that's the great adventure of these culturally specific productions, I think.
That was good, Gina.
Thanks. I practiced.
No, but I think, you know, I mean, there's something to be said about like moving the needle in society, because we're finally centering people who look like us and our experiences and our perspectives, and not putting us as like sidekicks around the default of like white male patriarchy Shakespeare, right? And so I don't know about meeting people in the margins, but we're certainly being centered and people can see us. Tana, you were going to say something. I saw your audio click off.
Yeah, I just love the thing about building a bridge and working with bilingual theater, which is what I primarily do, and having Spanish speaking audience and an English speaking audience in the same room in the same night is so delicious and such a treat, because we'll have a scene where it's primarily in Spanish and there's a lot of jokes, and you have every Spanish speaking audience like laughing and enjoying and giving and receiving. And sometimes you'll have a non-Spanish speaking audience that is like, should I laugh? Is this okay? Am I on in the joke and whatnot? But also just enjoying around, or other audience that just enjoys around them this communication and this giving and receiving that's happening on stage. And even though you don't understand exactly the words, you understand the context and you're giving as well, and you're receiving something as well. And I think I'm going a little bit off topic here, but I just think that with language, there's such a connection when you're going down the street and someone is trying to communicate, and you realize, okay, I'm going to speak Spanish because I see that you speak Spanish, and then there's like this, you understand me, you hear me, we're together. Okay, yeah, this is great, and it's like such a delight, and having that on stage just magnifies that. So I think that that is a really beautiful connection to have, even with people don't understand the language. Communication goes further than language. I mean, you can see emotions, that's universal. Content, I push you like that. It's an ad. And so I think it's breaking the fear of language and that barrier, whether it's like Shakespearean language or a different native language, and just being fully committed to receiving something. I think we build a bridge there.
Well, I've received so much from all of you this evening. We were just about hitting like a little over the hour mark. So I want to ask a final question of all of you. Is there a dream Shakespeare or a dream, I'll broaden it, a dream classical project that you'd like to work on in the future?
Does it have to be culturally specific, or just you want to work on it?
You can say just, it'll be culturally specific because you'll be in it, Debra Ann. Because whatever character you play will be Debra Ann in our mix raise deliciousness. You know,
Mixy. Yeah. I have my eye on Richard, and not just producing Richard, on playing Richard. I want to see what the challenge becomes when, okay, I've already girl transitioned and became a boy when I played Othello. So it's not that. It's, can I transition between a nice girl and a man who doesn't mind killing somebody? And doesn't mind. Now Othello, he had a problem when he killed them. He's, oh, I'm sorry, but Richard's not sorry. How do I navigate that? How do I as an artist create that for myself as an artist and for an audience to begin to look at and discover? There is culture. Sometimes we talk about race and specific nationality, but then there's also the gender thing, and how differently gendered people move in the world.
There'll be another panel plan for Doll Shakes.
What's that like? Yeah.
Tana, Gina. Oh, hi, Gina's daughter. Hello. She got shy. She ran away.
Yeah.
Like, dream about a production when I don't have to worry about cohabitating with children. Sorry.
Actually, I have a dream production, and I want your children to be in it. Actually, it's going to be everyone on screen right now, plus the kids. I'll tell you later. Tana or Maddie, do you have any dream projects?
I do, and it's for sort of personal reasons, but I love Macbeth. That is my favorite Shakespeare, and my dream production of this is, my father was a Colombian telenovela star in Colombia, which is a soap opera. And one of my best friends, Yajaira Paredes, is a Venezuelan telenovela star in Venezuela. And I would just love to have them both play husband and wife And I just would market the shit out of that, being like, William Márquez, Yajaira Paredes, los dos telenovelas.
I will buy like every ticket. I will be
That
like
sounds fun.
fangirling so hard. Oh my gosh.
Yes,
I have to dive into the concept more of like why both of them would only speak Spanish and no one else, and everyone else speaks English, and they both in United States, and the reasons for that. Also, them being way older than everyone else, but that is my dream production.
I fully support that dream production. Oh my gosh. Let me just be a piece of wood when Burnham Wood moves towards the capital. Oh my gosh. Patty.
Yeah, that I also support that production. So I'm really lucky in that, like, even in quarantine, I've been making like a weirdly large number of adaptations of Western classics. Like, I just opened a new adaptation of Antigone a couple weeks ago that was bizarrely in person because it was a university, but it was specifically to COVID times and specifically to the fact that it was the week of the election. And like what would happen if everyone had to stand with Antigone instead of just, us living in a world where women are expected to die for standing up and speaking. Like, what would it take to stop that? And then this week I've been working on Tlingit adaptations of both. Vera Starbird wrote a Tlingit Christmas Carol that comes out in chapters starting Friday, which is like so cute and so specific and like just adorable even on Zoom. And then she also has a Native Pride and Prejudice, and so I feel like very like heartwarmed with all like the Native adaptations of Western classics. But when it comes to Shakespeare, it was funny because when you asked that, I went, I actually, like, what came to mind was like slightly horrifying to me because it was like my least favorite Shakespeare play, and which is Hamlet. And I think it's because of the context. Like, I think it'd be really fun to do because I think the reason the context always bothers me is like it's so focused on him. But in that moment, I was thinking like of this idea of like, the fact that you bring all your ancestors with you and the fact that it begins with him, sort of like the fact that his father is present. And like, what if all of these voices weren't just his voice? Like, what if it was like more than him that is actually speaking, and like how might that like liberate the structure in some ways from it just being one man who's indecisive to being something like deeper within my own personal cultural context. So that was where my mind went, because I'm always like, well, why now? But then I was like, that I could get behind that Hamlet.
I could totally get behind that. Oh my gosh.
So my dream production is to be in all of those rooms, really. This is why I'm a dramaturg and not a director, because the idea of like just coming up with a concept right now, I'm just like, a lot of Asians in a room doing some, I can picture Shakespeare. Like, but I want to be in all of those rooms.
You can dramaturg my Vietnamese midsummer when I do it.
Yes, please.
We're descended, our mythology is we're descended from a fairy princess and a dragon king, like a river dragon king. And so those are Titania and Oberon right there.
Yes, please.
And then the new generation of like, like second, third generation, fourth generation, like new age Asians, like totally don't get it, and they're like the new young lovers. Like that's what we're gonna do. That's what we're gonna do.
B, after a moment of thinking about it, I realized I have a couple in my body, in my mind. There is in my body a Romeo and Juliet that sets in Puerto Rico, back in the 1500s or something like that, with the Taino Indians and the conquistadors, and what that looks like, what happens in that world, and the chance to explore that world, with the indigenous people from Puerto Rico, and what happened when the conquistadors showed up, and now they're all cohabitating, and Romeo is in love with Juliet. What happens in that world? We know what happens because we know the story. There's also in my head something that we've already began to look at in the form of a reading. We did the War of the Roses, which was like we put together Henry's part 1, 2, and 3, or I think that was right. And we had one family, the Lancasters. One family was Black folks, one family was white folks, and then all the French people were women, and we did that, and it was very culturally entertaining. It was very exciting. And so just to explore and play and see what might can work is I don't know. I don't necessarily trying to prove anything or expect anyone to give me permission about putting up these things. It's just try it. Let's just play. Let's just grow together. Let's just learn together. Let's just figure it out together. Let's just, I keep saying, let's just do it, you know?
On that note, let's play, let's explore, let's continue to make theater. Let's just do it. Thank you so much for engaging in an amazing conversation tonight. I wish we had, you know, more time together. I wish we were all sharing a bottle of wine and cracking open new ideas and new subjects. I would love to see you all again to have deeper, bigger discussions. But thank you so much. Thank you, Tana. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Debra Ann. Thank you, Maddie. I
Thank
appreciate
you, B.
all of you. I wish you comfort, health, joy, and lots of good eats. We thank you here at Del Shakes. Thank you, Del Shakes audience, for tuning
Yes.
in, for engaging in this conversation. If we didn't get to your questions, we're so sorry. I don't want to have the time run over too long. So I'll make sure that we'll get to your questions if they were unanswered in some way. We'll email you in some way and get those answers to you. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye, 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 bye.
Bye-bye.